The conference room was cold the way only corporate conference rooms get cold. Not from air conditioning, but from the kind of silence that precedes something irreversible. I remember exactly what I was looking at when they fired me. It was 2:58 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. The monitors in the corner of the room showed 3 of our live production dashboards. Green indicators, healthy throughput, latency at 12 milliseconds across all North American clusters, 140,000 concurrent users flowing through the platform like blood through a working heart. My heart, I had built that infrastructure from a $40,000 proof of concept running on borrowed servers to a $2.1 billion real-time cloud ecosystem, serving enterprise clients across 11 countries. I had written the core orchestration logic. I had designed the fail-safe architecture. I had negotiated the vendor contracts. I had recruited the engineers. I had personally supervised 31 production deployments, including 2 that happened on Christmas Eve because the business never slept and neither did I. None of that mattered to Derek Weston. Derek Weston, age 38, MBA from Dartmouth, the kind of man who wore Italian loafers to server room walkthroughs because he had never actually been inside a server room before. Derek Weston, whose father had founded Velara Systems 18 years ago on a handshake and a government contract, and who had inherited the CEO position the way some people inherit grandfather clocks. Not because they know how to maintain it, but because it was always going to be theirs. He sat across from me with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Beside him was Claudia Marsh, the new chief people officer who had been with the company for 4 months. She had a manila folder and the expression of someone performing concern. The third person in the room was Victor Liang, general counsel, who hadn't looked at me since I walked in. I knew before I sat down. You develop an instinct for these rooms. The water pitcher untouched, the chairs arranged at a specific distance, the lack of any agenda on the table. When you have built systems for as long as I have, you learn to read environments. And this environment was telling me everything. Derek spoke first. Marcus, he said, we appreciate everything you've contributed to Velara. Past tense, I kept my face completely neutral. The board has made a strategic decision to restructure our engineering leadership, he continued. We're moving toward a consolidated executive model, and as part of that transition, your position as lead infrastructure architect is being eliminated. He slid the folder across the table. I didn't open it. Effective immediately, Claudia added, as if that were a kindness. The monitors behind them continued to glow, green, healthy. 140,000 users. I looked at Derek for a long moment. Effective immediately, I repeated. Security will escort you to collect your personal items, Victor said, finally making eye contact. Your access credentials will be revoked at 3 p.m. I checked my watch. It was 2:59. I see, I said. I stood up. I smoothed my jacket. I picked up the folder, tucked it under my arm without opening it, and I looked at Derek Weston one final time. Good luck, I said. That was all. I walked out of the conference room, past the glass walls of the open office, past the engineers who glanced up from their monitors with the subtle, furtive alarm of people who sense something catastrophic but aren't sure yet what it is. I nodded to James, one of my senior engineers. He started to stand. I shook my head almost imperceptibly. Not now. I walked to my desk. I picked up 3 personal items, a framed photo, a physical notebook I'd carried for 6 years, and a small matte black USB drive that I kept on my keyring. Security was already waiting. Young guy, late 20s, had the decency to look embarrassed. I'm ready, I told him. We walked to the elevator. At exactly 3 p.m., I felt my phone buzz, an automated notification from Velara's identity management system. My credentials had been revoked, my corporate email gone, my VPN access gone, my dashboard logins gone. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. I pressed the button for the lobby, and then I opened a different app on my phone, one that wasn't on any Velara system, one that ran on an entirely separate infrastructure that no one at Velara even knew existed. I looked at the screen. I typed 2 words. I pressed enter. The elevator descended. At 3:07 p.m., every single one of Velara Systems' production servers went dark. Let me take you back 7 years, because nothing makes sense without understanding where I came from. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is not the kind of city that produces tech billionaires or Silicon Valley legends. It produces engineers, methodical, unglamorous, hard-nosed problem solvers who learn to fix things because things constantly need fixing and no one else is coming. My father worked for a logistics company for 22 years. He was an operations analyst, a job that technically required a 2-year degree, but actually required an obsessive mind capable of tracking 50 interdependent variables simultaneously and identifying the one that was about to break the entire system. I inherited that. I put myself through Ohio State studying computer science and electrical engineering simultaneously, working nights at a network operations center, monitoring infrastructure for a regional ISP. I was 19 years old, sitting alone in a dimly lit room at 2 in the morning, watching traffic dashboards, learning the language of systems the way you only learn it when you're the one responsible for what happens if they fail. I graduated in 3.5 years. I turned down 2 job offers from companies you'd recognize because I got a call instead from a startup called Corex that was trying to build real-time data routing software for the financial sector. They offered me less money. I took it anyway because the problem was interesting. That's always been my fatal flaw and my greatest asset simultaneously. I care more about the problem than the politics. I care more about whether the system works than whether I get credit for making it work. I am constitutionally incapable of doing mediocre work when an excellent solution exists and I can see it. At Corex, I spent 3 years building routing architecture that could handle microsecond-level transaction decisions at scale. When Corex was acquired by a larger financial data firm, my system became the backbone of their entire processing layer. I watched from the outside as the acquiring company quietly generated hundreds of millions in additional annual revenue from the infrastructure I had designed. The check they wrote me was a rounding error by comparison. I didn't say anything publicly. I just took notes. I spent 2 more years consulting. 3 companies, 3 infrastructure overhauls, 3 systems that were in crisis when I arrived and stable when I left. I charged a fair rate and I delivered every time. That's when I got the call from Velara. Velara Systems in those days was a different company than the one that fired me. When I joined, it was still founder-led. Marcus Weston Sr., Derek's father, had built Velara from a government contracting shop into something genuinely interesting. A platform for managing distributed cloud workloads across hybrid enterprise environments. Mid-market companies that needed the power of cloud infrastructure without the internal expertise to manage it were Velara's target market. The product worked. Barely. The architecture was held together with what I can only describe as technical folklore, decisions that had been made years ago by engineers who were long gone, documented in comments no one had updated, running on configurations no one fully understood. Marcus Sr. was sharp enough to know this was a problem. He was the kind of founder who had built the company on instinct and relationships, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his instincts about technology were running out of runway. He hired me with a simple directive. "Fix it," he said. "I don't care how. Fix it before it breaks something we can't recover from." That was my mandate. No politics, no bureaucracy. Just fix the system. I spent the first 90 days doing nothing but reading. Every log, every configuration file, every deployment script. Every architecture diagram, accurate or otherwise. I interviewed every engineer on the team. I traced every data pathway. I mapped every dependency. What I found was both worse and more interesting than I expected. The core platform had fundamental architectural problems, not bugs, but structural decisions that made the system fragile at scale. It could serve a few thousand clients reasonably well. It could not serve tens of thousands without failures that would cascade in unpredictable ways. But underneath those problems, buried in the code like a diamond in coal, was something genuinely brilliant. Marcus Sr. had attracted a few exceptional engineers in the early days, and they had built certain components, particularly around real-time load balancing and predictive resource allocation, that were legitimately ahead of their time. The system wasn't broken. It was unfinished. I presented my findings to Marcus Sr. in a 3-hour session with no slides, just a whiteboard. I drew the architecture as it existed, then I drew what it needed to become, and then I drew the bridge between the two. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "How long?" 18 months, I said. "If you give me the resources and the authority to make decisions without committee approval on technical matters." He extended his hand. We shook. That handshake meant more than any contract I'd ever signed. Over the next year and a half, I rebuilt Velara's infrastructure from the inside out while it was still running. Think of replacing the engine in a 747 while it's in flight. Every change had to be backward compatible. Every migration had to be invisible to clients. Every risk had to be contained within defined blast radiuses. We ran parallel systems for critical components during transition periods. I wrote custom tooling to monitor the health of both old and new systems simultaneously. I personally reviewed every deployment plan. I brought in 6 engineers I trusted, people I had worked with before, people whose judgment I knew, and together we executed one of the most complex infrastructure migrations in the company's history without a single client-facing outage. By month 20, Velara's platform could handle 10 times the previous load with half the operational overhead. Revenue followed immediately. When enterprise clients saw the performance improvements, latency cut by 70%, reliability above 99.97%, support tickets down by 60%, they started talking to their peers. The sales team, which had previously struggled to close deals over $200,000, suddenly found themselves in conversations with Fortune 500 procurement departments. In year 2 post-rebuild, Velara's annual recurring revenue went from $38 million to $94 million. In year 3, it crossed $200 million. The valuation that had languished at $180 million when I joined hit $900 million, then crossed $1 billion, then kept going. I wasn't doing this for the valuation. I was doing it because the problem kept evolving and I kept wanting to solve it. But I also wasn't naive. I understood what I had built. I understood what it was worth, and I made certain, quietly and methodically, that I understood every dimension of it. including the dimensions that no one else did. That was the decision that would matter later. Marcus Sr. knew what I had done. He never forgot it. He promoted me 3 times in 4 years. He gave me equity, not the small consultant's grant that HR originally offered, but real equity, negotiated directly, documented carefully. He trusted my judgment on technical hires, on vendor relationships, on infrastructure investments. We weren't friends exactly, but we were something better. 2 people who genuinely respected each other's competence and never lied to each other. Then, 2 years ago, Marcus Sr. had a heart attack. He survived, but he was 67 years old, and the recovery was harder than he'd expected. And the board, which had been patient with the founder's instinct-driven leadership during the growth years, began to see an opening. They moved quickly, they always do. Derek Weston had been nominally the president of Velara for 18 months before his father's heart attack. But in the way that title is sometimes given to a founder's heir as a transition plan that everyone hopes never actually activates. He had an MBA. He understood PowerPoint decks. He could speak fluently about market positioning, brand narrative, and stakeholder value. In meetings with investors and board members, he projected exactly the kind of confident, photogenic leadership that boards find reassuring. The engineers called him the suit, not to his face. But in the way that a nickname travels through a technical organization, everyone knew it within 3 weeks of his taking operational control. I want to be precise about Derek because I don't want to portray him as simply stupid. He wasn't stupid. He was something more dangerous. He was a smart person who had never been made to feel the consequences of being wrong. His father had caught the mistakes before they hit the ground. The board had covered for him. His salary had never been contingent on his performance in any meaningful way. He had all of the confidence of someone who had been right about everything, combined with the actual record of someone who had never been truly tested. That combination, in a person with authority over complex systems they don't understand, is catastrophic. His first move was hiring Claudia Marsh as CPO. Claudia came from a consumer tech company that sold lifestyle apps. She had never worked in enterprise software. She spoke confidently about culture, about talent density, about employer branding. She had a gift for making conversations about feelings sound like conversations about strategy. She and Derek immediately developed the kind of symbiotic relationship where each one's blind spots reinforced the other's confidence. The second move was quieter but more consequential. Derek began systematically replacing technical leaders with people who reported to him personally. Not because they were better, because they were his 3 senior engineers left in the first 6 months of Derek's full control. 2 were pushed out. 1 left voluntarily when he saw what was coming. Each departure was papered over with language about strategic realignment and evolving team needs. I watched this, I documented it. I said nothing, because my position was different. My position was structural. I wasn't just an engineer who knew a lot. I was the person who had designed the system that was generating the revenue that was funding Derek's ambitions. Removing me carried genuine operational risk that even Derek, in those early months, seemed to intuit. And so he tried to manage me instead of removing me. He began inserting himself into technical decisions. He would attend architecture review meetings and ask questions that were designed to sound sophisticated, but which actually revealed fundamental misunderstandings of what the system did. He would challenge decisions I had made, not on technical grounds because he couldn't, but on business grounds that were vague enough to be unchallengeable. Is this the most capital-efficient approach? He would ask, about a redundancy investment that would prevent a specific class of cascading failure. Does this align with where we want to be in 5 years, he would ask, about a security architecture decision that was responding to a threat that existed right now. What he wanted was not for me to explain the decisions. What he wanted was for me to understand that the decisions were now his to approve. I adapted. I learned to translate technical reality into language that satisfied his need to feel in control. I wrote decision memos that framed technical necessity as strategic vision. I let him take credit in board presentations for infrastructure improvements that his presence had actually complicated. I was not happy about this, but I was patient because I could see what was coming. And I was making preparations. The real breaking point came with what internally we called the Helios project. Helios was a proposal I had developed over 18 months, a next-generation infrastructure platform that would have positioned Velara not just as a cloud management vendor, but as the foundational layer for an entirely new category of enterprise AI infrastructure. The technical architecture was unlike anything on the market. I had 3 provisional patents filed. I had preliminary conversations with 2 major enterprise clients who had expressed serious interest in being design partners. The projected revenue impact, conservatively modeled, was $400 to $600 million in additional ARR over 4 years. I presented it to Derek in September of last year. He listened. He nodded. He asked 3 questions, all of which were about the marketing narrative rather than the technical substance. Then he told me he'd think about it. 6 weeks later, he announced that Velara was pursuing a strategic partnership with a vendor called Axiom Cloud, a company run by his college roommate Nathan Kessel. that sold middleware software of questionable technical merit at aggressive margins. The Axiom partnership was structured in a way that made Helios incompatible, not technically, contractually. The partnership agreement contained exclusivity clauses that would have prevented Vollara from developing infrastructure capabilities that competed with Axiom's product roadmap. In other words, Derek had traded a $400 million internal opportunity for a partnership with his friend's company. I went to his office. I closed the door. "Derek," I said, "the Axiom contract kills Helios." "Helios was one option," he said. "Axiom gives us speed to market." "Axiom gives Nathan Kessel a distribution channel," I said. The room got very quiet. "That's an inappropriate implication," he said. "Read the exclusivity clause on page 14, I said. I set a printed copy of the contract on his desk. He didn't touch it. "I've reviewed the contract with our legal team," he said. "Then your legal team should reread page 14, I said. I left his office. 2 weeks later, I was called in for a performance conversation with Claudia Marsh. It was the first performance conversation I had received in 6 years at Vollara. The feedback was vague: communication style, executive alignment, strategic partnership. The vocabulary of organizations that want to build a paper trail without being specific enough to be challenged. I knew what it was. It was the opening move. I went home that night and I made a decision, not about revenge. Not yet, about preparation, because there's a difference between knowing something bad is coming and being ready for it. I had known something bad was coming for 18 months. But knowing and being ready are entirely different states. I spent the next 6 weeks getting ready. Let me explain something about infrastructure that most people, including most executives, fundamentally misunderstand. Complex technical systems are not just collections of software and hardware. They are knowledge ecosystems. The code is the smallest part. The real value lives in the understanding of why things were built the way they were built, the operational instincts of the people who run them, and the undocumented relationships between components that don't appear in any diagram, but that, when broken, cause catastrophic failures in places that seem completely unrelated. I had spent 6 years building Volara's infrastructure. I knew it the way a surgeon knows the body of a patient they've operated on a dozen times. I knew where every nerve ran. I knew which systems were robust and which ones were deceptively fragile. I knew which vendor relationships required active management and which contracts had terms that would trigger automatic escalation if certain thresholds were crossed. I also knew something more specific. When I had rebuilt Volara's infrastructure 4 years ago, I had designed and implemented the core orchestration system that managed all of our cloud resource allocation. I had written most of it personally, along with 2 engineers who had since left the company. The system had been updated many times since, features added, configurations changed, patches applied, but the core logic, the engine that made all the decisions, was still my original code, and within that code there was a component that I had built and that I had never formally documented. It wasn't malicious. I want to be precise about this because the word backdoor gets used in ways that imply criminal intent, and that is not what this was. When I had built the orchestration system, I had included a master administrative interface, a control plane that sat above the normal management layer and allowed for direct intervention in the system's core decision-making logic without going through the standard change management processes. This was a legitimate engineering tool. It existed because sometimes in a crisis you need to intervene in a running system faster than any approval process allows. The interface required specific credentials that only I had. It was not listed in any documentation that had been shared with the broader team because it was a tool intended for emergency use by the infrastructure architect, me, and not for general administration. It was in the truest sense a master key, and when Vollara hired me there had been no explicit contractual clause about what happened to such keys if my employment ended. The standard employment agreement covered intellectual property developed during employment. The orchestration system itself belonged to Vollara. But the administrative interface, the master key, had been built using design patterns and architectural concepts I had developed before joining Vollara, incorporated into the system in a way that was not separately documented, and it was not clear legally whether it constituted company property or a personal tool that I had used to maintain company property. I had spent those 6 weeks consulting with an intellectual property attorney. An extremely careful, extremely precise one. Her opinion, delivered in writing, was that the legal status of the interface was genuinely ambiguous, and that Vollara would face significant challenges asserting ownership of it in litigation, particularly given the lack of documentation, the pre-existing nature of the underlying design concepts, and the absence of any explicit provision in my employment agreement addressing this specific type of administrative tool. She also told me what I could and could not do with it. I was not going to do anything illegal. I want to be clear about that, not because I was afraid, though consequences matter, but because that was never the point. The point was not to harm Vollara. The point was to demonstrate in the most precise and inarguable way possible exactly what I had built and what it was worth. And there was another piece of leverage, one that was entirely clean. The 3 provisional patents for Helios. When I had filed those patents, I had done so personally, through a separate IP holding entity I had established 18 months earlier, at a time when I had been actively considering whether to develop Helios internally or externally. The patents covered specific novel methods of distributed resource orchestration that formed the technical core of the Helios architecture. I had shared the Helios concept with Vollara. I had proposed it as an internal project, but I had never assigned the underlying patents to Vollara. There was no signed IP assignment agreement for Helios because Helios had never been formally approved as a Vollara project. Derek had said he'd think about it. He had never said yes. You can't own an idea you rejected. My IP attorney had been very, very clear on this point. So here was my position when I walked out of that conference room on a Tuesday in November. I held the master administrative key to Volara's core infrastructure. I held 3 patents on the technology that represented Volara's most significant near-term growth opportunity, and I held 6 years of institutional knowledge that, as I was about to demonstrate, no one else at the company possessed in anything approaching a functional form. I wasn't angry when I left. I was focused. There's a difference. The elevator ride from the 41st floor to the lobby takes approximately 90 seconds. In those 90 seconds, I opened the application on my phone, a custom-built tool I had developed over the previous 6 weeks. Running on a small cloud instance I maintained personally, and I navigated to the administrative interface. I did not shut down Volara's systems. I want to be precise about this, because went dark is how it was eventually described in the press. And the reality was more nuanced and, frankly, more sophisticated. What I did was execute a specific administrative command that changed the authentication configuration for a critical subset of the orchestration system's internal components. The command set the inter-service authentication tokens, the credentials that the various components of the system use to verify each other's identity when communicating, to a new value, a value that only I knew. The effect was immediate and total. The orchestration system's components could no longer authenticate with each other. Without authentication, they stopped communicating. Without communication, the resource allocation logic stopped functioning. Without resource allocation, the system's ability to dynamically manage the underlying cloud infrastructure collapsed. The infrastructure itself, the actual servers, the actual network, was still there. Nothing was physically damaged, nothing was deleted, no data was lost. The underlying cloud resources from our 3 main providers were still running, but the system that managed them, the nervous system of the entire platform, had gone silent. And when the nervous system goes silent, the body stops responding. At 3:07 p.m., Volara's monitoring systems registered the first cascade of failures. Services that depended on the orchestration layer began throwing errors. Load balancers that normally receive dynamic configuration updates stopped updating. Traffic routing that had been microsecond precise became static, then overloaded, then began dropping connections. By 3:11 p.m., the first client system started registering outages. By 3:15 p.m., Volara's operations center, staffed by a team of engineers who understood how to operate the system under normal conditions but had never faced a failure of this type, was in full crisis mode. By 3:22 p.m., Derek Weston's phone was ringing. I know the timing precisely because I had a contact inside the operations center, someone I had mentored, someone who trusted me, who texted me a single word at 3:22 p.m. The word was chaos. I was in my car by then, driving home through the November rain, the city lights smearing across my windshield, my mind very calm and very clear. I made 2 phone calls on the way home. The first was to my IP attorney. The second was to a man named Robert Sato. Robert Sato was the general partner of a venture capital firm called Meridian Capital, which had been a Vollara investor in the early days and had exited their position 18 months ago at a good return. Robert and I had stayed in contact. He was one of the most analytically precise investors I had ever met, a former engineer himself before he moved to the financial side, and he understood the difference between a company that was valuable and a company that just had a high valuation. "Marcus," he said, "what's happening?" "Vollara just fired me," I said, a long pause. "What's the state of the system?" he asked. "Compromised," I said. "Not permanently, but the team they have in place cannot resolve this without me." Another pause. "How long?" he asked. "Days," I said, "maybe more. Depends on how quickly they realize what they don't know." "And the Helios patents?" he asked. Robert knew about Helios. We had discussed it 6 weeks ago. I had been careful about what I shared and with whom, but Robert was someone I trusted with the full picture. "Filed personally," I said. "Never assigned," I heard him exhale. "Send me the documentation," he said. "All of it." "Tonight, already drafted," I said. I had been ready. The next 72 hours at Vollara Systems were what engineers call a post-mortem scenario, except normally a post-mortem happens after the crisis is resolved. This one was happening in real time, and there was no resolution in sight. I know what happened inside those walls during those 72 hours because people told me. People I had mentored, people I had hired, people who were still there watching the ship go down and who were quietly, carefully, Keeping me informed, the first response was disbelief. The operations team, good engineers, competent in their domains, ran every standard diagnostic they knew. They checked network connectivity, they checked server health, they checked application logs. Everything at the surface level appeared normal. The underlying infrastructure was fine, the servers were running, the network was connected, but the orchestration layer was unresponsive, and none of them knew why. The reason none of them knew why was the reason I had known would be the case before I ever left that conference room. The orchestration system's core architecture, the part I had written, was essentially undocumented at the level of detail that would have allowed another engineer to diagnose this specific failure, not because I had deliberately obscured it. Because I had been the only person who needed to understand it at that level, and organizations rarely prioritize documenting the expertise of their most senior technical staff until that staff is gone. This is one of the oldest and most consistently ignored lessons in enterprise software. The systems that are most critical are almost always the least documented, because the people who built them are always too busy maintaining them to stop and write things down. The operations team escalated to the senior engineering leadership. The senior engineering leadership, which, thanks to Derek's restructuring, was now composed primarily of people who had been managers longer than they had been engineers, escalated to the CTO. The current CTO was a man named Gary Feld, who had been hired 9 months ago from a SaaS company that made HR software. Gary Feld was a competent executive. He was not a competent infrastructure engineer. He had been hired because Derek wanted a CTO who would execute strategy rather than challenge it. Gary Feld looked at the orchestration system's codebase for the first time in his tenure and reportedly said nothing for several minutes. By the end of the first day, they had called 3 external consultants. None of the consultants had ever seen our specific orchestration architecture. They could read the code, but reading code and understanding a live running system are different skills, and the code was complex enough that reading it without context was like trying to understand a city by reading its zoning laws. By the end of the second day, Vollara had notified 6 of its largest enterprise clients that they were experiencing a service degradation event and were working to resolve it. The notification language was carefully chosen to minimize legal exposure, but enterprise clients have their own technical teams, and those teams had already identified that Volara's orchestration layer was non-functional. Several clients had begun invoking their SLA provisions. One had begun reviewing their contract's termination clauses. The financial picture was clarifying rapidly. Volara's platform managed infrastructure for clients who paid between $500,000 and $8 million per year for the service. A full outage triggered SLA penalties of up to 10% of annual contract value per day for the first 3 days, capped at 30%. The company's ARR was approximately $240 million at that point. With 42 enterprise clients on the platform, the exposure from SLA penalties alone was in the range of $8 to $12 million per day. By the end of day 2, the cumulative SLA exposure had crossed $20 million. And the system was still down. Derek Weston had, by all accounts, not slept. On the other hand, had slept extremely well. On the morning of day 3, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Victor Liang, Volara's general counsel, calling from his personal cell phone. "Marcus," he said, "I need to speak with you." "You're speaking with me," I said. "This is informal," he said. "Off the record." "I have no record to put things on or off," I said. "I no longer work there." A brief silence. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting," he said. "They'd like you to attend." He searched for the word, "as a consultant." "I'm listening," I said. "The platform situation," he said, careful with his language. "It's escalating. We need your expertise." "Victor," I said, "you revoked my credentials 72 hours ago. We can discuss compensation," he said. "Yes," I said, "we can." I gave him the name and number of my attorney. I heard him exhale. "Marcus," he said, and now the practiced legal calm was starting to fray at the edges. "We need this resolved quickly." "I understand the urgency," I said. "Have your team call my attorney?" I ended the call. Within the hour, my attorney had received contact from Volara's legal team. The initial conversation was by her account, conducted by people who were trying very hard to appear unhurried. They were not unhurried. The SLA clock was running and they knew it. My attorney's initial response was simple. "Marcus Weston is available for consultation at a rate of $85,000 per day, with a minimum engagement of 10 days, payable in advance. Additionally, any engagement agreement must address the matter of certain intellectual property currently held by Mr. Weston that is relevant to Volara's future strategic direction." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Volara's attorney said they would need to discuss this with their client. That discussion took approximately 4 hours. Then they called back and said they were prepared to discuss terms. Meanwhile, the board was convening its own emergency session. I had a source in that meeting too, not inside the boardroom but close enough to know the temperature. The board was, by all accounts, furious. Not at Derek, not yet, or not primarily, but at the situation. Boards have a remarkable capacity to direct their anger at circumstances rather than at the people who created them, at least initially, but the questions were starting to shift. Why was a single employee's departure causing a system-wide outage? Why had there been no documented succession plan for critical infrastructure roles? Why did no other engineer on the team have sufficient knowledge of the core system to resolve this? Who had been responsible for managing this knowledge risk? These are the kinds of questions that, once they start being asked, don't stop until someone is held accountable. And the only available answers pointed in one direction. On the afternoon of day 3, two things happened simultaneously. The first was that 3 of Volara's top 10 clients sent formal notices of intent to terminate their contracts if service was not restored within 48 hours. The second was that a financial journalist at the Wall Street Journal published a story with the headline, "Cloud Vendor Volara Enters Third Day of Outage Executive Silent." The story was careful and factual. It cited public SLA documentation. It cited client statements. It noted that Volara had recently undergone leadership restructuring and that its lead infrastructure architect had departed the company. It did not use my name. It did not need to. By 6 p.m. that day, Volara's board had authorized their legal team to accept my consulting terms. The check, $850,000, for 10 days at $85,000. Cleared at 9:47 p.m. I slept on it overnight. I arrived at Volara's offices at 9 a.m. on a Thursday, 4 days after they had escorted me out of the building. I wore the same jacket. I had a coffee in my hand and a very specific expression on my face. Not triumphant, not cold, just neutral. The neutrality of someone who is here to do a job and who knows exactly how to do it and who requires no validation from the room. The lobby was different. I could feel it before I reached the security desk. The building's energy, and yes, buildings have energy, especially office buildings in crisis, was the energy of a place where people are afraid. Not of me. Of what I represented, the security guard, a different one than the one who had escorted me out, issued me a visitor badge with a slight hesitation that told me he had been briefed. He handed it over without comment. I clipped it to my jacket. Victor Liang met me in the lobby. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days because he hadn't. "Marcus," he said, "thank you for coming. I'm here under contract," I said. "Where's the operations center?" He took me up. The operations center was on the 22nd floor, a large room with multiple monitor arrays, a central status board that was showing more red than I had ever seen it display, and 8 engineers who looked up when I walked in with the expression of people who have been bailing water for days and have just seen someone walking toward them with a pump. James was there. My senior engineer, the one I had nodded to on my way out. He stood up. "Marcus," he said. "James," I said. "Walk me through what you've tried." We spent 40 minutes in a methodical briefing. I listened without speaking, except to ask questions. Specific, precise questions that told the engineers, though not Victor, who was hovering, exactly what I was looking for. At the end of the 40 minutes, I sat down at a terminal, opened the administrative interface, and in 11 minutes and 20 seconds, I resolved the authentication configuration issue, restored inter-service communication, and brought the orchestration layer back online. It took 11 minutes and 20 seconds. After 4 days of crisis, the room was very quiet as the status board shifted from red to yellow to cluster by cluster green. One of the engineers actually covered his mouth with his hand. James looked at me. 4 days, he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was something else. Something between admiration and grief. "Yes," I said. Victor Liang was staring at the board. "That's it," he said. I turned and looked at him. "That's it," I said. He understood in that moment, fully and completely, what the firing of Marcus Walker had cost this company. Not just in SLA penalties and client risk and reputation damage. In the most fundamental sense, in what had been standing between the system and silence, one person who understood it completely, and they had fired him for upsetting Derek Weston. I spent the remaining 9 days of my consulting engagement doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was stabilizing the system and conducting what I formally called a knowledge transfer and documentation initiative, which sounds bureaucratic but was, in practice, one of the most important things I had ever done. I spent hours with James and 4 other engineers, walking through the orchestration system's architecture layer by layer, documenting everything in the obsessive detail that should have existed years ago. I created runbooks, decision trees, failure mode analyses, and annotated code documentation. I did this because I am constitutionally incapable of leaving a system underprepared for failure, even a system that had just been used against its owners. The engineers deserved to understand what they were managing. The second thing I was doing was entirely separate. 3 days into the consulting engagement, Robert Sato called me. "I've talked to 2 LPs, he said. "They're interested. Define interested," I said. "One of them manages a sovereign wealth fund's tech allocation. The other is a family office that backed 3 infrastructure plays in the last 5 years. Both have read the Helios documentation. And," I said, "they want to fund a standalone Helios development entity," Robert said, "independent of Volara, with you as founder and technical lead." The silence on my end was not uncertainty. It was the sound of pieces clicking into place. "The patents are clean?" he asked. "My attorney has confirmed it 3 times, I said. "Then we can close in 60 days, Robert said. "We're talking $40 million Series A pre-money valuation at $120 million. I let that sit for a moment. $120 million, I said, for a company that doesn't exist yet. For a company that holds 3 patents on technology that Valara desperately needs and cannot build, Robert said. For a company founded by the engineer who built the infrastructure that $1 billion in enterprise value depends on. That's not a bet on potential. That's a bet on a certainty. He paused. Also, he said, you should know that 2 of Valara's board members have reached out to me in the last 48 hours. Asking questions about the Helios patents, I said nothing. I think the board is beginning to understand the full picture, Robert said. Good, I said, because here was the full picture. Valara had fired the person who had built their core infrastructure. In doing so, they had triggered a 4-day system outage that had cost them an estimated $34 million in SLA penalties and had put 3 of their top 10 client relationships in serious jeopardy. Their current engineering leadership had demonstrated publicly and categorically that they could not maintain the system without me, and the technology that represented their most significant growth opportunity, the Helios architecture, was patented by an independent entity controlled by the person they had fired. The board was not slow. Boards can be many things, but when money is bleeding and liability is accumulating, they are not slow. On the 6th day of my consulting engagement, I received a request for a meeting not from Victor Liang, not from Derek Weston, from Eleanor Park, the chair of Valara's board of directors. Eleanor Park was 71 years old, had founded and sold 2 technology companies, had served on 8 boards, and had a reputation for being the kind of board chair who was decorative in good times and decisive in bad ones. She had been relatively quiet during Derek's tenure. She was not quiet now. We met in a private conference room on the 41st floor, the same floor where Derek had fired me. I don't think that choice of location was accidental. Eleanor Park was small and precise, with gray hair cut in a way that suggested she had stopped caring about performing femininity sometime around 1995 and had never looked back. She was accompanied by one other board member, Gerald Cho, a former operating partner at a major PE firm, and no lawyers. That was interesting. Marcus, she said, thank you for agreeing to meet. Of course, I said. I'm going to be direct, she said. The board has been conducting its own assessment of the last 2 weeks' events. We have some conclusions. I'd expect so, I said. The decision to eliminate your role was made by Derek Weston without full board visibility into the operational risks that decision created, she said. I want to acknowledge that. I appreciate the acknowledgement, I said. The board's view, she continued, is that the company is in a critical position. We have significant client retention risk. We have a gap in technical leadership that is not being adequately filled. And we have become aware of intellectual property that is relevant to our strategic direction that we do not currently control. The Helios patents, I said. Yes, she said. They are not Valara's, I said. I understand, she said, which is why I'm here. She placed a folder on the table. The board is proposing to offer you a role as Executive Vice President of Engineering with a compensation package that I think you'll find reflects the actual value you bring to this company. I didn't open the folder. Eleanor, I said. With respect, I'm not interested in a role at Valara. A very small pause. I see, she said. I am, however, interested in a commercial arrangement, I said. Specifically, I am in the process of establishing a separate entity that will develop and commercialize the Helios architecture. That entity is open to a strategic licensing relationship with Valara as one of several potential customers. Gerald Cho leaned forward slightly. A licensing arrangement, he said. Yes, I said. Helios as a service. Valara would be one client among several. The terms would be commercially standard. The pricing would reflect the market value of the technology. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment. And Derek, she said. I paused. That, I said carefully, is a question for the board. Another long pause. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose it is. There is something I haven't told you yet. Something that changed the nature of this entire situation in a way that the board didn't fully understand until I explained it to them in a follow-up meeting 2 days later. While I had been building the Helios architecture, over the 18 months between conceiving it and presenting it to Derek, I had also been having quiet conversations with people in the market, not formal sales conversations, exploratory conversations. The kind that sophisticated technical executives have when they're genuinely interested in understanding whether a problem they have might be solved by an approach they're hearing about. I had spoken with technology leaders at 4 major enterprises. Companies that were Valara clients or had been or could be. Companies spending $2 to $8 million per year on cloud infrastructure management. After I was fired, after I'd retained my attorney and confirmed the patent status and connected with Robert Sato, I had reopened those conversations. Now I was no longer exploring. Now I was pitching. And the pitch was compelling in a way that a pitch from inside Valara could never have been, because it was unencumbered by Valara's existing contract structure, Valara's existing product limitations, and Valara's existing relationship with Axiom Cloud, which, it turned out, 2 of those 4 technology executives actively disliked, because Axiom's middleware had caused integration problems in their environments. Within 3 weeks of those conversations being reopened, 2 of the 4 companies had signed letters of intent to be design partners in the Helios development program. The combined value of those design partnerships, in terms of committed fees and equity equivalent arrangements, was $22 million for a company that had not yet incorporated. When I presented this information to Eleanor Park and the board, the room went very quiet. Eleanor looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. "These are Valara clients," she said. "2 of them are," I said. "1 currently, 1 former." "You approached them while under consulting contract with Valara," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was a precise observation. The consulting contract covered infrastructure stabilization and knowledge transfer," I said. "It contained no non-solicitation or non-compete provisions." Victor Liang drafted it in some haste, as I recall. Another pause. Gerald Cho pressed his lips together in a way that might have been admiration. "I see," Eleanor said. "The Helios entity has a clean path to market," I said. "Valara can be part of that path, as a preferred customer with favorable pricing and a strategic relationship. Or Valara can watch from the outside as its clients migrate to a next-generation platform." "That's a remarkable position to be in," Eleanor said, "for someone who was escorted out of this building 11 days ago." "Yes," I said, "it is." 3 days later, Derek Weston was called into a board meeting. I was not present, but I know what happened because Eleanor Park, with a directness I had come to respect, told me afterward the board had reviewed the full chain of events: the Axiom partnership, the Helios rejection, the firing, the outage, the SLA penalties, the client risk, the patent situation. They had also, as boards sometimes do in crisis moments, become curious about the Axiom partnership in a way they had not been before, and what they found upon scrutiny did not look better up close. The Axiom deal had been structured at terms that were favorable to Axiom, specifically at a price per seat that was 40% above market rate, with minimum commit volumes that required Valara to effectively subsidize Axiom's business regardless of performance. Nathan Kessel, Axiom's CEO and Derek's college roommate, had subsequently announced a $15 million funding round in which Derek's name did not appear, but in which a family trust associated with a Weston entity had reportedly made a private investment. I did not surface this information. I didn't need to. The board's own due diligence process, accelerated by crisis, found it. Derek Weston's meeting with the board lasted 45 minutes. He resigned at the end of it. The press release, issued the following morning, described the transition as a mutual decision in the context of a strategic leadership evolution. Derek was quoted thanking the company for the opportunity. Eleanor Park was quoted expressing confidence in Valara's future. Nathan Kessel's company, Axiom Cloud, was notified that Valara intended to exercise its termination rights under Section 14 of their partnership agreement, a provision that allowed termination for cause in the event of undisclosed conflicts of interest on either side. Axiom's attorneys contested this. The matter was referred to arbitration. I didn't follow it closely. I had other things to focus on. Meridian Capital's term sheet arrived 38 days after I left Valara's building for the last time. $40 million. Pre-money valuation of $120 million. Robert Sato joining the board as an observer. Clean terms, standard preferences, no onerous control provision. Named the company Lattice Infrastructure. The name came from the mathematical concept of a lattice, a structure that is simultaneously ordered and flexible, capable of supporting enormous weight because of how its components relate to each other, rather than because any single component is strong. I had always thought that was a better way to think about infrastructure than the common metaphors of pipes and highways. I incorporated in Delaware, leased office space in Austin, not Silicon Valley, not New York, not because I was making a statement, but because I had an offer on a house there and liked the winters, and began building. The first 3 hires were James and 2 other engineers from Valara. They called me. I did not recruit them in any way that violated any agreement. They simply looked at what I was building and asked if there was room. There was room. The 4th hire was a product manager named Diane, who had spent 8 years at cloud infrastructure companies and understood, precisely and practically, how enterprise buyers made decisions about platforms. She had been following the Valara situation from the outside with professional interest. She came for a coffee meeting. She stayed for the pitch. She called me the next morning. "When do I start?" she said. "Monday," I said. By month 4, Lattice had a prototype of the core Helios architecture running. By month 6, we had it in production with our first 2 design partners, the same companies who had signed letters of intent before Lattice even existed. The results were what I had projected 18 months ago when I'd shown the initial concept to Derek on a Tuesday afternoon in a glass-walled conference room. While he thought about the marketing narrative, latency improvements of 40 to 60% over existing solutions. Resource utilization efficiency that translated to 25 to 35% infrastructure cost reduction for clients. A management interface that required a fraction of the operational overhead of competitive platforms. The design partners were not quiet about their results. By month 8, we had inbound inquiries from 11 additional enterprise prospects. By month 10, our pipeline had crossed $80 million in potential ARR. Robert Sato called me on a Friday afternoon. "The Series B conversation is already starting," he said. "I know," I said. Valuations are going to be aggressive, he said. I know, I said. How do you feel about it, he said. I thought for a moment. Like I felt the first time I saw the Velara codebase, I said. Like there's an enormous amount of work ahead and I can see exactly how to do it. Robert laughed. That's the right answer, he said. The commercial relationship between Lattice and Velara was formalized in month 11. Velara had brought in an interim CEO, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had successfully turned around 2 enterprise software companies and who was, from everything I could observe, the kind of operational leader the company had needed for the last 2 years. She moved quickly. She cleaned up the Axiom situation. She stabilized the client relationships. She overhauled the engineering leadership structure. And she called me directly, on my personal number, 4 months into her tenure. Marcus, she said, I've reviewed the full situation. I have 2 questions. Go ahead, I said. First, she said, is there any universe in which Lattice would consider a strategic acquisition? No, I said. Noted, she said, without missing a beat. Second question, what would it take for Velara to be your most important customer? I smiled. We spent 3 weeks negotiating a licensing agreement. Velara would license the Helios architecture from Lattice on a 5-year term, with pricing tied to usage volume. The initial year's licensing fees were $12 million. Year 2 projections based on Velara's client growth trajectory under Sarah's leadership suggested $18 to $22 million. For Velara, the economics made sense. The technology would generate revenue far in excess of the licensing cost. For Lattice, Velara's scale as a customer accelerated our own development timeline and provided the kind of reference client that changes conversations with other prospects. For me personally, it meant that the infrastructure I had spent 6 years building was still generating value for the people who depended on it. The enterprise clients, the end users, the engineers who ran it day to day, that mattered to me. It had always mattered to me. The signing was done by email. Sarah signed on behalf of Velara. I signed on behalf of Lattice. There was no ceremony. There didn't need to be. I did allow myself one small observation delivered in a brief note to Sarah alongside the signed documents. This technology was always worth what I told them it was worth, I wrote. The only variable was who would ultimately get to prove it. She responded within the hour. Agreed. And I'm sorry the lesson was so expensive. Derek Weston's story did not end quietly. The arbitration with Axiom Cloud became public in its broad outlines, not the details, which remained confidential, but the fact of it. Combined with the reportage around the outage and the subsequent management change, enough had been written to make the Velara chapter of Derek's career a cautionary tale rather than a success story. He has not, as far as I know, taken another executive role. Nathan Kessel and Axiom Cloud reached a settlement with Velara that I did not follow closely. The Axiom product was gradually deprecated from Velara's platform over the following year. The board, for its part, overhauled its governance procedures, specifically around technical due diligence for strategic decisions and risk assessment for key personnel transitions. Eleanor Parks cited the Velara situation in a subsequent interview as an example of the governance failure that occurs when operational complexity is invisible to the board. I read that quote and thought about the 18-month performance conversation, the Axiom contract, the afternoon in the conference room, invisible to the board, not to me. Never to me. The difference was that I had been one person, and boards are structures, and structures move at the speed of processes, and processes are slow until the crisis is expensive enough to make them fast. I don't feel contempt for the board. I understand them. I understand how organizations fail, not through malice usually, but through the slow accumulation of deferred accountability. I feel contempt for the system that allowed someone like Derek Weston to make decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars based on personal relationships and ego rather than competence and evidence. But contempt doesn't build anything, so I build instead. Lattice's Series B closed 14 months after we incorporated $180 million. Pre-money valuation of $680 million. I remember sitting alone in our Austin office the evening after the wire cleared at 11 p.m. with the building empty, looking at the numbers on a screen. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, moving, indifferent, alive. I thought about the conference room on the 41st floor, the cold air, the water pitcher, the 3 people across from me, the monitors in the corner showing green indicators. I thought about the handshake with Marcus Sr., who had died 8 months ago at 71, a second heart attack, final this time, and a loss that I still felt in a complicated way that I don't have language for, because he had been the person who had given me the latitude to build something real, and I had never gotten to tell him what we built became. I thought about James and the engineers in the operations center on day 1, watching the status board shift from red to green in 11 minutes and 20 seconds. I thought about Robert Sato saying, "That's a bet on a certainty." I thought about the application on my phone and the 2 words I had typed in the elevator. Those 2 words were not shut down or kill or anything dramatic. They were the name of the authentication token configuration command, a technical action. A specific, limited, legally defensible technical action that demonstrated, with the precision of a controlled experiment, exactly what the value of one person's knowledge had been: $2.1 billion in infrastructure. 7 minutes, 11 minutes, and 20 seconds to fix it. And $680 million in value to show what it had been building toward the whole time. Epilogue. What stays with me, people sometimes ask me what the lesson is. They expect me to say something about loyalty or fairness or the importance of documentation. And those things matter. They're real lessons, practically speaking. But that's not the thing that stays with me. What stays with me is something more basic. I had spent 6 years building infrastructure at Velara. During that time, I had two kinds of conversations. One kind was about the system, what it could do, what it needed, what it would become. Those conversations were almost always good, almost always honest, almost always productive. The other kind was about position, who had authority over what, who was seen as valuable, who was going to get credit, who was aligned with whom. Those conversations were almost always bad, almost always dishonest, almost always about something other than what they claimed to be about. Derek Weston lived entirely in the second kind of conversation. He had no native language for the first kind. He couldn't evaluate the system. So he evaluated the people, and he evaluated them based on whether they made him feel in control. I had made him feel out of control. So he had removed me, and in removing me, he had proven, in the most expensive and public way possible, that the system was what I said it was and that I understood it, and he did not. He thought he was firing a difficult employee. He was actually running an experiment, and the results were unambiguous. That's the thing that stays with me. Not the satisfaction of the outcome, though I would be dishonest if I said there was no satisfaction, but the profound clarity of a situation in which the truth about value was impossible to hide. The system knew. The system had always known. Systems always know. People can lie. Processes can obscure. Organizations can paper over reality with titles and org charts and performance improvement plans. But systems don't lie. Code doesn't lie. Infrastructure doesn't lie. Pull the right thread and everything is revealed. I had spent my entire career learning to pull the right threads. At Velara, at the worst moment of my professional life, I had pulled the most important one, and what came through was the clearest truth I have ever been paid to demonstrate. The value was never in the title. It was never in the badge, the business card, the conference room, the equity grant, the org chart, the LinkedIn profile. The value was in what I had built, and what I had built no one could take from me, not in 7 minutes, not in 70, not ever. If you watch this to the end, you already understand why the best engineers in the world don't fight for recognition. They build. They document the system in the only language that doesn't lie, and they wait.